It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC, live from the Greene Space today, here on the ground floor of our building at 160 Varick Street, where it's not snowing yet. Thanks to all our live audience members for coming. Thanks to everyone out there for listening in your homes and cars and earbuds, wherever you are. Our first guest in just a minute will be New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, whose column today explains the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica expose in the context of the Trump campaign they were being paid to help in 2016. That is, Cambridge was. There are really two Cambridge Analytica exposés now. There was the one we talked about on yesterday's show from the New York Times and The Guardian, which learned through a whistleblower that this data company that had Steve Bannon as vice president went fishing for people's personal information with a personality survey. Here's that whistleblower, a shorter version than we used yesterday, former Cambridge Analytica employee Christopher Wiley.
They had apps on Facebook that were given special permission to harvest data not from just the person who used the app or joined the app, but also it would then go into their entire friend network and pull out all of the friends' data as well. So if one person, if you joined the app, I would not just see your Facebook profile, I would see all of the Facebook profiles of everybody that you're friends with. We would only need to touch a couple 100,000 people to expand into their entire social network, which would then scale us to most of America.
And people had no idea that their data was being taken in this way?
No. If you were a friend of somebody who used the app, you would have no idea that I've just pulled all of your data.
So that's Christopher Wiley with an interviewer from The Guardian. There's also the Facebook piece of the scandal, apparently allowing Cambridge Analytica to mine our personal information in this way, getting up to 50 million people, almost all of them without our approval, violated some kind of consent decree. And Facebook stock, maybe you noticed this, went down 7% yesterday. Maybe investors think someone might actually get serious this time about holding Facebook accountable for the way it enables foreign interference in American elections and other abuses, and they'll have to settle for a little less profit. But that's old news now. That was yesterday's Facebook Cambridge Analytica expose. Then there's today's Cambridge Analytica expose from Channel 4 television in the UK, which includes some very low-tech, very old-fashioned ways of helping the candidates who pay them, like, as Michelle Goldberg's column points out, entrapping their clients' opponents by sending, quote, very beautiful Ukrainian sex workers to their homes. And Alexander Nix, head of Cambridge Analytica, didn't realize he was being recorded by Channel 4 when he said this about wielding foreign influence by laundering people's identities.
So often we would set up if we are working, then we can set up fake IDs and websites. If there are any students doing research projects attached to the university, we could be tourists.
Right.
There's so many options.
Okay.
We can look at. We have some experience.
So that might have been a little hard to understand. I guess that's what you get when you clandestinely record someone in a restaurant. But he said, many of our clients don't want to be seen to be working with a foreign company. We can set up fake IDs and websites. We can be students doing research projects attached to a university. We can be tourists. There's so many options we can look at, unquote. Now, Cambridge Analytica, what does it all mean for American democracy, for how we should think about Donald T. or Mark Z. and election security? We'll talk to Michelle Goldberg now about that and some of her other recent columns, like on a West Virginia teachers' strike, which you may not have noticed at all here in New York, but having national implications, the serious side of the Stormy Daniels scandal, and her one in this week's Sunday Review section, maybe you read it, in which she says, burn it down, Rex Tillerson. Hi, Michelle. Thanks for coming to the Greene Space.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And listeners, our phones are open for anything you want to ask Michelle Goldberg about today's column called Trump's High-Tech Dirty Tricksters, or her other recent work, 212-433-WNYC 433. 9692. Same thing for all of you here in the Greene Space. Raise your hands, and we can come around with the mic. Or I guess you could take out your cell phone and call in if you want. You know. So your column reminds us that Steve Bannon was Cambridge Analytica VP before joining the Trump campaign officially, and Michael Flynn was also an advisor to the firm. I guess, like Trump himself, they hire the best people.
Right,
Trump.
and it's almost wholly owned by the Mercer family, which are major Trump patrons.
Well, that was the question I was going to ask. Who owns Cambridge Analytica, and why does it matter?
Well, so it matters to us particularly, both because it's entwined with several members of the Trump entourage and was deeply involved in Trump's election campaign. There's a BBC documentary that's worth watching about this, where they go inside the San Antonio Digital Center of the Trump campaign. The Trump people called their program Project Alamo, and when the reporter asks, why do you call this Project Alamo, I think they assumed that it had some sort of Texas connection. In fact, they said no, it's named after the data set Alamo that Cambridge Analytica gave us. And Cambridge Analytica has their own section there in the San Antonio headquarters, and they pointed out, here is the brain of the operation. So they are basically at the core of the Trump digital operation. And one of the interesting things that happened after the election, you know, it was this big shock to people, and we started hearing, well, Trump was running this sort of brilliant social media campaign under all of our noses. And there was this Forbes piece that credited a lot of this to Jared Kushner and treated him as if he was some secret analytics super genius, which is so weird if you live in New York and know anything about Jared Kushner, who's, you know, right, his biggest claim to fame is this disastrous real estate deal. And he ran kind of a small gossipy newspaper with a pretty subpar website. And from people who work there say he knew nothing about technology. So this story was always sort of fishy, right? That Jared Kushner had masterminded this whole thing. And now I think we have a better picture of it. If they had a social media edge, and I think they did, it's because they stole a ton of information, and that information really allowed them to do enormously precise micro-targeting, right? So basically, they cheated. And so that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is just having these incredibly corrupt, dirty tricksters on your payroll, and kind of what that says about your willingness to do. I should say, a lot of people who are really paranoid about Cambridge Analytica think Cambridge Analytica is really sinister. We're nevertheless completely gobsmacked by these latest revelations.
Can't take your eyes off them.
Right? And so, you know, so what does it mean when you have people who are, you know, kind of willing to engage in blatant criminality on behalf of their clients working in our presidential election? I think that's something we still don't totally know, but we have to find out.
Well, is it criminal, or is it just sort of lax practice on the part of Facebook?
Well, we're talking about two different things. So the Facebook stuff may not be criminal, or it might be, you know, it could be that Facebook has broken certain rules and regulations. No, the criminal stuff I'm talking about are the bribes and hookers.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. And you put this in the context, at least potentially, of the Russia investigation, because they had some kind of connection with Julian Assange from WikiLeaks with regard to Clinton emails?
Right. So we already know that Alexander Nix, who's the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, had reached out to Julian Assange about obtaining and disseminating Hillary Clinton emails. So his broader role in the Russia investigation is unknown. Mueller has months ago asked Cambridge Analytica to turn over all their Trump-related documents and communications. Adam Schiff, who is the ranking member on the House Intelligence Committee, has really wanted Alexander Nix to go testify. I think he did it via video, but they haven't been able to bring them in. And they've been really frustrated by the Republicans sort of shutting down all their efforts to learn more about Cambridge Analytica. Apparently, the latest installment of the Channel 4 expose, Alexander Nix is going to be talking more about the role that they played in the Trump campaign, and also the lengths they went to circumvent congressional investigators. So, you know, we'll know more about this tomorrow. But there's clearly, and then there's another piece of this that's a little bit, I feel like, tricky to talk about, because you don't want to kind of get paranoid and become a nut job and start seeing Russians everywhere or suspecting every Russian who pops up in American life. But it is true that the person who collected all of this data for Cambridge Analytica, this guy Alexander Kogan, who incidentally later changed his name to Dr. Spector, which, let's remember, is the name of the supervillain organization James Bond. Why he did this, I don't know. But anyway, so he's a professor at Cambridge, right? That's why they called it Cambridge Analytica, to try to capitalize on his academic credibility. And it turns out that unbeknownst to almost all of his colleagues at Cambridge and left off his resume, he has a simultaneous appointment as a psychology professor at the University of St. Petersburg, where he's getting grants.
Not Florida.
Right. where he's getting grants from the Russian government. And again, academics are allowed to work in Russia, so you don't want to draw too many inferences from this, but it's one of many, many kind of dangling threads in this whole thing.
And you note in your column that it's hard to judge how well this kind of psychographic profiling really works. But I thought it'd be interesting for our listeners and our Greene Space audience to hear Cambridge Analytica's managing director, Mark Turnbull, describe what psychographic profiling is, or a little bit of how it works. I think most people know what demographics are: your age, race, sex, income, things like that. Well, here's 45 seconds of Mark Turnbull, managing director of Cambridge Analytica, telling Britain's Channel 4 how psychographics work. And remember, once again, he doesn't know he's being recorded.
The two fundamental human drivers when it comes to taking information on board effectively are hopes and fears, and many of those are unspoken and even unconscious. You didn't know that was a fear until you saw something that just evoked that reaction from you.
Right.
And our job is to drop the bucket further down the well than anybody else, to understand what are those really deep-seated underlying fears, concerns. There's no good fighting an election campaign on the facts, because actually it's all about emotion.
No good fighting an election campaign on the facts. It's really all about emotion. Pretty interesting. But many good ad campaigns play on our hopes and fears and try to surface them from our unconscious. So let's say this is all true, Michelle, and Cambridge Analytica, owned by the Mercers, working for Donald Trump, was able to communicate with 50 million Facebook users about their unconscious hopes and fears. That doesn't force anyone to vote for Donald Trump or refrain from voting for Hillary Clinton. They still have to be convinced of something by the arguments. Do you think that this makes Trump's election, regardless of what we may think of him, any more tainted than it was yesterday?
Well, sure, it's a little more tainted. Because it's still cheating. And to me, one of the things that's frustrating about all of the various ways in which they've cheated is that I don't think the dispositive thing in the question of whether the election is tainted or illegitimate is whether any one thing finally swung the election, right? The Watergate burglary delegitimized Richard Nixon, even though nobody thinks that the Watergate burglary contributed in any substantial way to Richard Nixon's landslide victory in the 1972 election. And so, yes, you're right. On the one hand, what they do does not seem measurably different than what other kind of advertising firms do, and they have some degree, I think, of mystique around what they do. They're sort of like Steve Bannon in that they try to pretend that they are these evil geniuses with, some special access to tools of psychology and, manipulation. And really, they are not that different, it seems, from other data firms, with one exception. They have access to a lot more information than anybody else, not because they're geniuses, but because they stole it.
And with Michelle Goldberg, New York Times columnist, here's one more clip of company head Alexander Nix, again secretly recorded by Britain's Channel 4, on hiding the true intention of what they put out on Facebook.
It has to happen without anyone thinking that's propaganda. Because the moment you think that's propaganda, the next question is, who's put that out?
Yes.
So we have to be very subtle.
The moment you think that's propaganda, then you're asking who's put that out. So they're trying to put out propaganda in such a way that nobody asks about their identity. And I think we have a caller who sort of wants to address that point. So let's go to Stephen in Holmdel, calling in for New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg, whose column today is about this new Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal. Stephen, you're on WNYC. Hi.
Hi, good morning. I wanted to bring up the point that immediately when this very important story was broken, the whataboutism started that, Obama did it too, and some Obama campaign data person put out a tweet saying, hey, this is like what we did. It is in no way, shape, or form similar. The Obama campaign created a campaign app that said the Obama campaign app, asked people's permission to download it, and after they downloaded it, they would then participate and recommend their friends, whatever. It was all up and up, and it was consent given. The Trump campaign used the data from that researcher at Cambridge, who of course has another Russian connection, which is supposedly not important, and took the data someone else was collecting. And being an academic, he had more wide-ranging ability to collect data because it was for academic purposes only. And that's what he sold and gave to Cambridge Analytics. I mean, the whataboutism has to be challenged right up front because it's the difference between consent about, a crime of someone raping someone, and it's not a crime if someone gets the consent and permission to have sex with someone.
Stephen, I'm gonna leave it there, and I hear your point, and you're making it very clearly, and we really appreciate your call. I noticed there's a listener who's tweeting something related, but really kind of the opposite assumption. This person tweets, "Keep the focus on the criminal. Data mining for likely voters must have been used by Hillary Clinton, too." And that's just a surmise. There's no evidence. But what do you think, Michelle? Was the Clinton campaign just not playing at this sophisticated a level, or do you really want to impute better morals and ethics to them?
Well, I think that the Clinton campaign, sure, clearly people are doing data mining and data collection on likely voters. I think that's very different than having a psychologist collecting vast amounts of information under false pretenses and then breaking Facebook's terms of service to sell it to this group. They just weren't doing the same thing. And the Hillary Clinton campaign, whatever you think of them, was just not engaged in the scale of misinformation, dark propaganda, deceptive advertising that was meant to look like the far left and to encourage people not to vote. They weren't doing that sort of thing. And I guess you could argue, I suppose, well, maybe they should have been. I think that that's kind of a dark road for us to be going down. And one other point I want to make about the Obama campaign, there's some of this you can't, you're right. The first caller is right that they weren't underhanded in the way they collected this data. The tools have also changed since the Obama campaigns in terms of what you can do with this data. So there are things, for example, called lookalike audiences, where you can basically, as somebody who had helped found Facebook was explaining to me the other night, if you say have 50,000 profiles, you can then use these tools that Facebook rolled out for advertisers in 2013 to find every single other person on the network who has those same characteristics. And so it just so if you have 50 million profiles, it just allows you to slice and dice the audience, and these aren't just 50 million profiles worldwide. These are 50 million American voter profiles. So 1 in 3 people who voted in this election, they have a way to slice and dice and tailor their message that just didn't exist in previous elections.
By the way, listeners, I neglected to say when we introduced the show that whenever we're here in the Greene Space, you can watch as well as listen to the Brian Lehrer Show. So if you go to thegreenspace.org, we are streaming live video from the Greene Space stage here. You can see Michelle Goldberg and me talking, and then later Jim Florio and other guests who will be coming up. That's the Greene Space with an E at the end of Greene, thegreenspace.org, and you can see our live streaming video of the Brian Lehrer Show today. Let's go to another caller. Here is Aaron in Midtown Manhattan. Aaron, you're on WNYC. Hello.
Great. Thank you. That's a great show. I actually kind of, have an issue with the fact that everybody thinks this is a new big deal. Everyone going back the last 10, 15 years in the tech industry has been building tools that's allowed the capture of any kind of local piece of information or psychographic piece of information. Yahoo at one point 10 years ago had 5,000 cookies on everyone's machine. So, this is really something that is an extension, maybe a scaled extension of everything that really has been going on in the traditional browser mobile industry. It's now been extended to the to the social side, primarily because of the technology behind it. These social companies use something called graph theory, graph searching. So once you get a piece of information, the vector of that can just extend.
Aaron, I'm gonna jump in for time. I get it. So as a tech sector veteran, are you familiar with this consent decree that Facebook apparently signed? Because you're saying, this technology of data mining, various kinds of data mining, have these kinds of things have been used for years. Do you think this is something that society needs to deal with and restrict in ways that we're not effectively restricting it now, because so many people's information was effectively gotten in ways that may not be criminal without them realizing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. In Europe, they're kind of, backhanded way to do it is the data protection agreements they have. But in the U.S., we'll really never do that because of restraint of trade rules. And so the fact that every time you go to a website or a mobile app, everyone just scrolls down at the bottom of that crazy set of agreements and just clicks I agree, because you want to get the coupon or whatever. That's the key. If you stop doing that, I don't use any of that stuff. Everyone thinks I'm strange for having almost no apps on my phone except news and stuff. That's the key. You have to stop using the technology that everybody feels
right. That's being put out there as bait. But Aaron, you could get 50%. You could get 50 cents off low-fat ice cream. Aaron, thank you very much for your call. We really appreciate it. And I'm also reminded that you can see the streaming video, folks, also at the WNYC website. So you can go to thegreenspace.org or just go to WNYC.org if you want to watch us here live in the Greene Space with Michelle Goldberg, New York Times columnist. And actually, I want to go into some of your recent columns because there are other things going on in the world that you're writing about besides Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. In the Sunday Review section, headline, "Burn it down, Rex." You want Rex Tillerson to do what?
Well, and that was actually, that was a line I stole from a Republican source of mine. So basically, the piece was about how we've heard from the beginning of this administration that there were, that there were sober adults in the room who were going to contain this impetuous and unprepared president. And that's how some of the people who had decent reputations who've gone into this administration have tried to salvage their reputations by saying, God knows what would be happening if they don't say it, they kind of say it through strategic leaks or through their spokespeople or through their friends. Well, you don't know the crazy stuff that they're stopping from happening. So you've had all of these people who kind of, rather than present themselves as collaborators with this regime, have presented themselves as like the human guardrails. And now they're increasingly gone. And as they leave, on the one hand, we're seeing that to some extent they were right because things are getting a lot worse without them. But by shoring things up for so long and kind of protecting the country from the consequences of the person who's in office, they've allowed him to consolidate a lot of power and to get more comfortable in the job as he learns to transcend all these restraints that people have put on him. So the question is, now that there are increasingly few adults in the room and kind of getting fewer every day, the rumors are that H.R. McMaster is going to be one of the next to be pushed out and to be replaced, God help us all, by John Bolton. What are these people's responsibility to the country? I think their responsibility, for at least most of them, is to now tell us what it is that they saw, what it is that they were supposedly protecting us from, what it is that has now been unbound in this administration. Because, instead of just, Gary Cohen and Dina Powell and some of these other people who've been sort of, who are being allowed to regain their place in their old industries and in New York society, as if they have not participated in this really kind of foul and disgusting regime. There are arguments to be made, including by one of my Republican sources who says, well, no, Michelle, you're wrong. In the case of these two in particular, Dina and Gary, they need to maintain their credibility with the administration, their ability to influence it from the outside. In case there's a real emergency, you want people who are cleared and qualified and who can go in and help manage. So, okay, I'm half convinced by that. But who that doesn't apply to is Rex Tillerson, right? Rex Tillerson is never going back to this administration. He's got no relationship with this president. He has humiliated himself. He was once one of the most powerful people in the country, and now has been kind of completely tarnished. The first line of his obituary is going to be that he was one of the worst Secretary of States in American history, if not the worst, that he was fired by tweet, and that the administration later put it out, this was since my piece came out, that they fired him while he was on the toilet. I mean, these people are animals. And
instead of what he did for most of his career, which is run ExxonMobil or work his way up.
Right, run ExxonMobil, which basically had its own foreign policy. I mean, he was the head of its own state within a state. He was certainly a far more influential and respected person in business than Donald Trump.
So what could Rex Tillerson say?
I think he could go on 60 Minutes or, on whatever forum he chooses, and first of all, tell us why it was that he called Trump a moron, which he has refused to deny, what it is that he saw as the chief diplomat, how it is that foreign policy is being made, why it is that Jared Kushner, who can't even pass a security clearance, is out there meeting with foreign leaders without any sort of support staff, how much of our foreign policy is being influenced by the national imperative of refinancing 666 Fifth Avenue, how what's going on, with the Iran deal? Why are we participating in the blockade of Qatar? I mean, there's all these kinds of strange foreign policy things. Oh, and then and most importantly, I think, or not most importantly, but importantly, how are Trump's business interests and Ivanka Trump's business interests influencing the way we conduct foreign policy? How is kind of money flowing back and forth? There's a lot that he knows, and so and part of what I can't entirely say what he should say, because he knows a lot of things that none of us do. But I think it's imperative that he let us all in, because if these so-called grown-ups aren't there to protect the country from this, impetuous lunatic of a president, then everybody else should at least know what they're up against. And it's not that impeachment proceedings would start tomorrow. They obviously wouldn't. But it would start chipping away at the power of this administration and start kind of, right now, Trump feels completely empowered and unbound, and in some ways that's when he's at his most dangerous. And so it would clip his wings a little bit.
And let me take one call for you on the scenario of what if impeachment proceedings do actually begin from the Russia investigation, from anything that might be revealed by Rex Tillerson or out of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, or even Stormy Daniels, and we're not really going to have time to get to what you wrote about why that's serious and not primarily a sex scandal. but a campaign scandal. But let's take a call from Maria in Morningside Heights. You're on WNYC with New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg. Hi, Maria.
Hi, thank you, and thanks so much for taking this call, because I've been wanting to ask Ms. Goldberg about this. Which is, I've read some of her writings about the Dominionist movement, and she wrote a column in the Times a year ago about Trump's Trojan horse. And once reading about this, I can't look at anything that Tom Cotton does or says, or Mike Pence, or the fact that none of the Republicans are doing any work at all in the Congress. It's as if they're just waiting for Trump to go away so that Pence can assume his rightful place in the Dominionist movement, as you've written about. And I'm curious, because I don't see you writing about it concurrently now. But you know, as I say, I feel like Tom Cotton is president in waiting. I feel like they're waiting to get their theocracy in order, just because you've written so eloquently about this. So I wanted you to address this.
Okay, so Dominionism is a strain of kind of political Christian fundamentalist thinking, which basically holds that Christians have the right to rule, more or less. And, you know, Mike Pence has been involved in this movement. Some of these other people have been involved in this movement. And there's a lot of people who basically think of Pence as sort of impeachment insurance, right? Trump might be bad, but do we really want Pence in there? I just don't believe it. I think that Trump is doing everything that he can for the religious right. I mean, there's never been an administration that is so craven and beholden to the religious right. I mean, not because he cares, obviously, but just because these are his constituents, and because he's not because he's not restrained by sort of normal political considerations. And so I think we already basically have kind of Pence's social policy with Trump's incredible instability. And if Trump were to be impeached, I think Pence would be a weakened figure, and in some ways just a more normal figure. So it's not that I think that Pence isn't a dangerous president, that he wouldn't be a terrible president, that it wouldn't represent a lot of regression for the issues that I care about most, but I just don't think he has the ability to bulldoze our basic civic and democratic institutions in the same way.
Please thank New York Times columnist Michelle Goldberg.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Brian Lehrer on WNYC. More live from the Greene Space in a minute.
Displaced and desperate.
We are staying in only one room, one bed, for all of us. And food make for the children. We don't have anything for them.
6 months after Hurricane Maria, Puerto Ricans in temporary shelters struggle to start over. That's next time on The Takeaway, weekday afternoons at 3 on 93.9 FM.
Support for WNYC comes from Glenmead, an independent trust company providing investment and wealth management services to families, endowments, and institutions. More from Lee Miller at 212-328-7331. NYU Skirball, where Gob Squad, the European arts collective, set their sights on Tolstoy's opus War and Peace, only to discover that neither war nor peace is coming without a fight. March 29 to 31st at nyuskirball.org. The Jerome L. Greene Foundation, committed to New York City's cutting-edge performing, digital, and visual arts communities.
If you believe democracy requires a free press, your station is WNYC, 93.9 FM and AM 820, NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live from the Greene Space today. And remember, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch the show as well as listen to it. We stream live video from the Greene Space stage at wnyc.org or thegreenspace.org. And quick reminder about a couple of our guests tomorrow. Jonathan Weissman will be here. He's just written a book about basically being Jewish and anti-Semitism during the Trump era. And we'll have the mayor of New Orleans, Mitch Landrieu, who's also written a book, and he's being mentioned as a possible Democratic presidential nominee for 2020. So are about 53 other people, but Mitch Landrieu is definitely one of them, and he will be on tomorrow. My next guest right now is a legendary New Jersey political leader. Democrat Jim Florio was in Congress from the Camden area from 1975 to 1990. Among other things, he sponsored the Superfund Environmental Cleanup Act when toxic waste was arguably the #1 issue in the Garden State. So 1975 to 1990 in Congress, and then he became governor. Now, last week, Jim Florio was there in the front row as the new governor, Phil Murphy, delivered his budget address. And right away, as you may have heard, Republicans started calling Murphy Florio 2 because of Murphy's proposed tax hikes to have what Murphy calls a fiscally and morally balanced budget. Jim Florio is now 80 years old, and he has a memoir called Standing on Principle. We're so grateful that you came to the Greene Space. Welcome back to WNYC. And
I will take myself out of the presidential run.
Right now. Are you ruling it out, or are you just saying you're not thinking about it now? And a few of you, if you're really, really careful listeners, might recognize him as Jim from Metuchen a few times on the phones. I won't take you all the way back to Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn, but I will take you back to your election to Congress. It was the 1974 post-Watergate election. Nixon had resigned that summer, and you beat an incumbent Republican as part of that total blue wave across the country in 74, a backlash like some people think Trump is in for, and the Republicans in Congress are in for this year if people see him as the Nixon of our time. So take us back to that election. Can you remind us how much you ran on, Nixon was a Republican, so throw the bums out, and how much on local concerns?
Well, I ran in 1972 and lost. That was the McGovern year, you may recall. So I've been on both sides of landslides. One side is much better than the other.
It also shows how quickly things can change, because it was really a red wave. I don't think they said red and blue in those days, right? But Nixon won in a landslide in 72, and Democrats took Congress in a landslide in 74.
The Watergate babies. The Watergate scandal resulted in President Nixon leaving office, and that year, a huge number of Democrats prevailed, myself included.
So are there lessons from 1974 that Democrats running this year could learn from?
I think so. I mean, you've got public opinion being formed across the board that what is happening out of the Trump administration is not good for this country. And therefore, people who are on that side have to defend the president. It's a very hard thing to do, or they don't defend him, in which case they lose a portion of the base that they rely upon. So they're in a bad place.
What about lessons from the Watergate and obstruction of justice investigation into Nixon for the Russia and obstruction of justice investigation of Donald Trump?
Well, I think in both cases, there are examples and evidence of obstruction. This has been fairly clear. That's what the Comey incident is about, as well about what some of the other things that we're discovering now are about as well. So, I mean, part of the book that I've just written, that you mentioned of, is to talk about lessons to be learned. I mean, learning from history helps us understand what's going on now and helps us to foresee what's going to happen in the future.
And listeners, New Jersey listeners, or anyone else, if you have a question for former Governor Jim Florio, 212-433 WNYC. His new book is called Standing on Principle, 212-433-9692. And those of you here in the Greene Space audience, raise your hand. I know we have a percentage of the audience here from New Jersey. You can raise your hands, or of course anyone can if you want to ask Jim Florio a question. You were elected governor in 1989, same election day as David Dinkins became the first black mayor of New York City. It seemed like a liberal era was dawning after 8 years of Ronald Reagan, finally over, and 12 of Ed Koch, who had increasingly become a racial polarizer. And you succeeded a Republican governor in New Jersey, Tom Kean. And to boot, the Berlin Wall came down that same month, November 1989. And yet, there was a really big recession in America at that time, too. How do you remember the moment in time generally in our country? And what did you think that you were elected to change in New Jersey?
Well, one of the things that was a big issue, some people may remember, was the environment and the environmental problems we had in New Jersey. The Jersey Shore was closed much of 1988 and 1989. Toxic waste were washing into the waters, sewage sludge into the waters, garbage being disposed of from New York barges washing onto the shore. And I campaigned vigorously on trying to make sure that our Environmental Protection Agency did the job that it was supposed to be doing. That was a major issue in the campaign.
Well, the Republicans now are calling Governor Murphy Florio too, and it's not a compliment. They see you as a one-term governor because you raised taxes in your first year and never politically recovered. How much do you think, or do you acknowledge that that's what happened?
Oh yeah, the combination of tax increases, which nobody likes taxes, but the question is, we have to appreciate the wisdom of the fact that nothing is for nothing. So even in New Jersey now, we've got college education is becoming unaffordable in many instances for people. There are a whole bunch of different issues that are really underfunding. There's underfunding for our infrastructure. New Jersey Transit used to be a premier transportation system. Now it's an embarrassment. It's almost negligence over the last number of years, almost reaches criminality in terms of not funding our transportation system. So there are problems that have to be dealt with. And the question is, do we have a spending problem? And I think that's not the question. We have a revenue problem, and therefore we're going to have to raise revenues if we want quality services from the administration.
And you think the voters just didn't get that, or weren't able to accept it at that time?
Well, it takes long sometimes, particularly now. Governor Murphy is in a situation where everyone is fully aware of the problems. I mean, now there's no surprises. When I came into office, no one was aware of the fact the recession was starting and problems were there. I was left with a horrendous budgetary problem that we had to deal with. And the question was, do you deal with it or do you walk away from it? I dealt with it, and I'm comfortable with that.
So any lessons for Phil Murphy based on your experience?
Yeah, the big lesson, and this is the theme of the book in some respects, is that in public policy areas, nothing gets done that's good unless you have citizens, real citizens, average citizens, engaged and informed. Engaged and informed is absolutely essential. I mean, the best example I can give you is our effort to ban assault weapons in New Jersey. When we took that issue on, the NRA became fully involved. Everyone was intimidated. We were able to prevail to get it done, and the end result was that we were able to go out and get the legislature, a particularly hostile legislature, to support my effort to veto their ability to undo the ban that we put into place.
And actually, you talk about an engaged citizenry. One of the recent Michelle Goldberg columns that we didn't get to with her was her writing about the West Virginia teachers' strike in the context of, as she put it, one of the ways that Trump may actually be making America great again is that it's gotten so many women as well as men to be energized and to get involved in our politics as regular citizens.
Let me just tell you a little bit about the campaign that we put together, which is really, I think, New Jersey's finest moment. What we did when the other side, the Republican side, wanted to repeal it, we mobilized people around the state. We had ministers go talk about how gun violence was a moral issue. We had educators talk about how children were affected by violence in the neighborhoods. We had police officials talking about how they were literally outgunned in certain sections of our cities, with the bad guys having more firepower than they did. There were a whole bunch of people we put together, healthcare people. We had a doctor from the Newark area testify that the military in Washington would send their surgeons to Newark, New Jersey to learn how to deal with gunshot wounds. It was something that, after a while, when we finished with our campaign, we did editorial interviews and things of that sort. No senator, no Democrat or Republican, would vote to overrule my veto of their effort to ban. It was really, as I say, New Jersey's finest hour.
So what changed? Why was it possible to pass an assault weapons ban in the 90s at the state level in New Jersey? Also, Congress did pass a national one in the 90s that they couldn't renew when it expired in, I think, 2004. Why is it so much harder today, even with all the school shootings?
Because we haven't had leadership that we need. These young people from Florida are really providing us for leadership, and that's a very important thing to do. You've got to be out there talking about common sense. The campaign that we lodged against the NRA and the gun lobby really was framed by providing the question, is New Jersey better off if we have more access to Uzis and AK-47s? And the response came back from citizens, of course not, are you crazy? You don't need those types of things. These are military weapons. And the whole idea of the Second Amendment being challenged is just farcical, because there's no question about the fact even Anton Scalia agreed that reasonable restrictions on gun rights are authorized under the law. Then the question is it reasonable to say that 40% of gun owners don't have any kind of background check? Is it reasonable to say that no hunter needs a 30-round or 50-round clip of things? All of these things are obvious. Is it reasonable to say that there's something wrong, that a terrorist can't get on an airplane but can buy a gun? Is it reasonable to go spend money to buy police vests to protect them, then authorize armor-piercing cop-killer bullets? All of that stuff is so obviously reasonable that somebody should not be able to argue that you can't do those things.
And yet, public opinion comes out on the side that you were just arguing, and yet the laws don't change.
But that just illustrates the power of even small cadres of well-organized, well-financed people. The gun lobby doesn't represent the majority of people in this country. So what we have to do is keep things out front. And one of the things that the NRA does very well, and they're doing it now, they've gone quiet after the incident in Florida. They try to run out the clock. And I suspect what they're doing right now is hoping for June to come along. The students leave school. They dissipate around the state. And then they think maybe in September they won't remember. I think it's important for the public interest to make sure this doesn't go away.
Former New Jersey Governor Jim Florio, our guest in the Greene Space. His new book, Standing on Principle, 212-433-WNYC, as we talk about New Jersey then and New Jersey and the country today, 212-433-9692, or raise your hand here in the Greene Space. And we have an audience member with a question. Hi.
Good morning, Governor and Brian. I'm Jack from Jersey City. I have a question about the pension reform or lack of pension reform. It does seem like you can't just tax our way to prosperity in New Jersey without really examining tax reform of the pension system and also consolidation of government services. You know, being in Hudson County, I don't know how many police departments, fire departments, school boards we have, but you know, there's all people that are going to retire and draw pensions, and many people retiring very early. And that does seem like the third rail of New Jersey politics. So
you're right. I mean, the problem is of magnitude that is almost indescribable. The pension system is underfunded by in excess of $60 billion. I was the last governor to fully fund the pension system. After me, Democrats and Republican governors didn't contribute to the pension system as was required. As a result of that, we have this huge deficit. And ironically enough, the employees contributed to the pension system over all these years. It was the state that didn't contribute its money. As a result of that, that money didn't go into the pension system. The earnings off of that money, likewise, didn't go into the pension system. And we've got to honor the obligations that we have, but it's not going to be an easy thing to do. And I think Governor Murphy has made a substantial contribution this year in his budget proposal to start getting the pension system funded.
I'm curious if you think, as an embattled almost from day one in office, and then what turned out to be one-term governor, if you think you were one of the first victims of modern right-wing talk radio. WABC had recently gone from their old music format to conservative talk with Rush Limbaugh, who had just come on in '88, 1 year before your election. Also Curtis Sliwa and Bob Grant and Barry Farber. Some of our older listeners will remember, of course, Curtis Lee was still around, but the other names. And they just hammered you and Mario Cuomo, who was governor of New York then, and David Dinkins day after day, plus 101.5 in New Jersey. And there was no big station with liberal talk. There was no MSNBC on television yet. Was talk radio a factor in your political challenges, or just an annoyance, or did it not even cross your radar screen?
Actually, it was a factor, but there were other factors as well. Before we had the Tea Party, we had something in New Jersey called Hands Across New Jersey, which was the same type of thing. We had a number of other organizations that were put forward. The NRA campaigned vigorously, but they did it quietly. They funneled money into this group, the Hands Across New Jersey group, and therefore they hid themselves because they understood they were not going to prevail again in the public arena, but they could give money and organizing skills to people who had an argument on taxes.
A precursor to the Tea Party, really.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So you have a chapter in your book on bridging the partisan divide. Remembering back to Hands Across New Jersey and everything else, have you seen polarization increase? And you were in Congress for 15 years, in the 70s and 80s. Polarization has increased?
Absolutely.
Or do we just always see polarization and think it's the worst of it ever was? Like the 60s, oh my God, we're remembering 1968 this year because it was 50 years ago, and student strikes and, the Democratic Convention riots and everything else.
It's unquestionably worse than it ever was. When I was in Congress, and part of the chapters of my book are the things that I was able to get done with bipartisan support. That doesn't exist anymore. And frankly, the real way to keep this in mind is that every society has splits. There's always people who are doing well, people who are not doing well. The people who are not doing well want to change the status quo. The people who are doing well with the resources try to oppose changing the status quo. Upward mobility has been the safety valve for us in this society, to the degree that upward mobility is starting to be stopped. The safety valve is blowing off. And therefore, this inequalities that exist are causing frustration for those who want to change the status quo. They become more shrill. That's the Tea Party. They become more shrill, and then the forces of the status quo become much more defensive, put more resources. And you have this fight, because if you cut off upward mobility, there's no hope for people who start out in life moving up. I'm a high school dropout. I quit high school when I was 17 and I joined the Navy. I have a GED diploma. I went on and did things that I did for my life because education is another word for opportunity. I've worked hard and get ahead. But if you tell people that start down here that they can't have any prospect whatsoever of getting up here, then you're going to have a serious problem. That's the problem we have now.
But then that must be a failure of both parties, of the establishment, because power has gone back and forth, certainly at the national level as well as in New Jersey, to create a consistently productive economy.
In the old days, you had people in the Republican Party, Lowell Weicker was an example. You had people who were moderate, thoughtful, analytical. On the Democratic side, you had the same people. Do you have outliers in both parties? The answer is yes. The problem is the outliers no longer are outliers. They're starting to be the dominant force, particularly the case in the Republican Party. They're the dominant force in terms of just making sure that there's no collaboration.
Let's take a call. Anna in Nutley, who I think is kind of on this point. You're on WNYC with Governor Florio. Hi, Anna.
It's Ann, yes. And I just to the point that he just made regarding Republicans then and now, the governor that came before Mr. Florio was Tom Kean, and he seems like such a liberal right now compared to the Republicans that we see in our current government. But anyway, my point was to ask you If you have any ideas with regard to how labor unions have fallen out of favor just throughout the whole country, unions seem to be not be supported right now, and what can we do to encourage people to go back to that sort of line of thinking? The unemployment rate is supposedly improving, but people are in jobs that pay $8.25 an hour. That's not enough money to earn a living, but yet they're not supporting the idea of labor unions overall. Culturally,
Thank you. Governor?
Well, it's a difficult thing because the workplace is changing. We don't have the mass old CIO union settings where you had industrial workers in huge facilities. In New Jersey, we used to have 3 or 4 major automobile manufacturing facilities with hordes of people working. That's no longer the case. Now you go to an automobile factory, it's robots and small numbers of people. So the job market is changing. What we have to do is start preparing people through job training and other programs, educational programs, to be prepared for the jobs of the future, which are going to be much less manufacturing jobs, much more service jobs. Manufacturing, by the way, is going forward. We're being productive in our manufacturing area. We're just not hiring people to do it.
And she mentioned Governor Tom Kean. Now we look at him as a liberal, Republican governor who preceded you. People talk about your loss in your re-election bid in 1993, but you were in some legendary other campaigns before you were governor. Didn't you lose to Kean by a whisker in 1981, and it took until weeks after Election Day to get a final count?
1,797 votes. It's a number that sticks with me. Out of 2.5 million. By the way, Tom Kean and I have become very good friends. We do programs together and things of that sort. But yes, I was involved in a couple of different campaigns over the years.
And that was almost 20 years before Bush versus Gore. But reading some history last night, I saw the Republican Party allegedly had cops serving as a ballot security task force during that extended count. And, it was nearly 35 years before the Russian hacking of 2016. What happened in that post-election day battle?
It was 30 days, I think it took to recount and there were issues that were raised, a whole bunch of issues. The Security Ballot Task Force was probably something that was most troubling. This was the National Republican Party, hired off-duty policemen and sheriffs and things of that sort to stand with armbands at the polling places. Not everywhere, just some places in the cities where minorities were, and clearly intimidated a substantial number of people. By the way, that still exists. The order that was ordered by the court after the election, which was unfortunate, inhibited people from doing those types of things. And that still exists at this point.
And I forgot until I was reading up on you last night that in 2000, you ran for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate from New Jersey, and you lost to John Corzine, who was a Goldman Sachs rich guy who spent you under the table, and obviously he went on to be governor. Did you get to know John Corzine when he was senator or governor? He was your rival in that race, but did you come to know and like him?
We've become friends as well, and he's a very, very well-oriented person. He's got good social values and whatever. He just was not comfortable in politics. The race you talked about, I think I was outspent $37 million to $2 million. But, I mean, one of the things that I've learned, and in the book I talk about, is there's opportunities to learn from defeats as well as from victories. In some respects, you learn more from a defeat as to what you did that was inappropriate and gives you the opportunity to correct it. So I've had the opportunity to lose some races, learn from them, and then win on a couple of occasions.
And the conclusion of your book, and this will be the last question, is called The Issues I Still Care About. And they are issues everyone will recognize, no matter what age they are. Climate change, guns, infrastructure, income inequality, and the public school inequality as a reflection of that. The New Jersey, I should say, pension crisis, which came up here from an audience questioner, and big money in politics. I mean, to read that list, a person could get depressed, like maybe there hasn't been much progress since 1989 or 1974 in this world. How much do you see it that way?
Any successes that we've had in some of those areas has resulted from this whole concept that I emphasize, getting real citizens engaged and get real citizens informed. The problem is very complex. So you need to have people with a full understanding of the options, what the alternatives are. And when you do that, maybe it takes some time, but ultimately the public interest will prevail because the majority of people are reasonable.
Former New Jersey Governor Jim Florio, his new book is called Standing on Principle. Please thank Governor Florio. This is WNYC FM, HD, and AM New York, WNJT FM, 88.1 Trenton, WNJP, 88.5 Sussex, WNJY, 89.3 Netcong, and WNJO, 90.3 Toms River. We are New York and New Jersey Public Radio. Brian Lehrer with you live from the Greene Space today. Remember, you can watch our Greene Space shows as well as listen. Just go to WNYC.org, where we are streaming live video. And if you do it really quick, you can see Shamita Basu do the news. Hi, Shamita.
Hi, Brian. First, a developing story out of Maryland where there's been a shooting at a high school this morning. Authorities are saying there are 3 injuries, including the shooter, and all of them have been taken to a hospital. No fatalities. FBI agents are on the scene at Great Mills High School. We'll bring you more on this story as we have details. Federal investigators say a package that exploded at a FedEx facility near San Antonio is believed to be linked to the string of bombings in the Texas capital this month. There were no reported injuries in this morning's blast. The movie and TV studio that Harvey Weinstein co-founded has become the first high-profile company to be forced into bankruptcy in the nationwide outcry over workplace sexual misconduct. The company also announced yesterday it was releasing victims and witnesses from the non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from speaking out about Harvey Weinstein's alleged misconduct. The New York City Council is investigating Jared Kushner's family real estate company. The probe, launched yesterday, follows up reports saying the company routinely filed false paperwork, declaring it had 0 rent-regulated tenants in dozens of its buildings in the city when it actually had hundreds. But records show it also claimed tax breaks for those same apartments, which New York City agencies failed to catch. Mayor de Blasio says that's because of previous mayoral administrations.
We found 4 years ago when we got here that most government agencies had almost no contact with other agencies, no coordination, like all sorts of information that should have been shared wasn't. We tried to break down some of those silos, some of that separation, but we got a lot more to do.
The Kushner company says the paperwork was outsourced and has been corrected. It denied that it intentionally lied in order to harass tenants. And today, March 20th, 2018, would have been Mr. Fred Rogers' 90th birthday. He was the host of the kids show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and so we're calling on him for a little help with the weather today. Here is a jazzy rendition of Mr. Rogers' song, It's You I Like, played on his show in 1986 by a very young Wynton Marsalis. And I'll say this, if it's snow you like, I've got good news. Our area is expecting anywhere from 12 to 15 inches of it over the next 2 days. Today, there's a chance of rain in the afternoon, expected to turn into a mix of snow and sleet overnight. Tomorrow is when it could really come down. Heavy, wet snow, as I said, up to a foot in some parts of the tri-state area. Now, despite the dismal forecast, today is the first day of spring. Technically, the spring equinox is at 12:15 p.m. and 28 seconds Eastern Time. And the reason that I know the exact time is because the spring equinox is also Nowruz, the Persian New Year. Now, my family celebrates the Persian New Year. My mom is from Iran. It's kind of our biggest holiday in my family. And there are many other countries and cultures that celebrate Nowruz as well. So last year I was here in the Greene Space with you, Brian, and with our audience, who I'm pointing at you as if you're all the same exact people. But we had an audience in the Greene Space and we celebrated Nowruz together. And I talked about some of the things that we do on the day. And just a few weeks ago, I got a tweet from a listener, Phoebe Epstein, and she said, I remember you spoke about Nowruz last year. I'd love to hear more about it this year. can you tell me about some of the traditions of the holiday? So I want to tell you about a Nowruz adjacent tradition. It happens just a few days before the New Year normally, and it's called Chaharshanbe Suri. And now what we do on Chaharshanbe Suri, it happens on the Wednesday preceding the New Year, so it happens the night before really, so Tuesday evening. And you're supposed to make a small bonfire, or better yet, make a series of small bonfires, and you jump over them. Now, this isn't walking on coals or anything. You're just jumping over some very easy to jump over fires. And I didn't grow up doing this. I guess my mom decided it just wouldn't be a good idea in our driveway in New Jersey to make small bonfires and jump over them. So I, for the very first time, went to a Chaharshanbe Suri event this year. And it was happening in a community garden in the East Village. And apparently it's happened there every year for the past 9 years. So I want to show you a video. We actually have a video of me jumping over the fire. You can see it in the Greene Space here, or if you're tuning in live.
And where's that fire?
So this fire is in a community garden. It's called La Plaza Cultural. I'm about to very ungracefully jump over the fire there. There it is.
That was you?
You can see that was me in the red.
Right. Now for people...
Oh, thank you. Wow, what a great crowd here.
First time anyone ever got a round of applause for celebrating New Year's Eve.
Oh man, you're too kind. Well, so everyone was doing it at this event. Like I said, Community Garden was La Plaza Cultural in the East Village, and I spoke to the organizer of this event. She was there. Her name, I have it here, is Simin Farkandeh. This is the 9th time that she's organized it. She calls it the Zoroastrian Fire Jumping Ceremony, and here she is.
We jump over it as a ritual to cleanse ourselves for the new year. And also, it's a way for us to give light to the ancestors who've passed, to let them know that we're going to be merry with them for that whole night. And I really remember and cherish the memories I have of jumping over fire in Iran. I felt that they were always very empowering, and I knew that I wanted to give that not just to my daughter, but to other kids her age.
So a lot of the people that I spoke to at the event had moved here from Iran, and they had really fond memories of doing this when they were kids back in Iran. Now, Nowruz is more of a cultural holiday than it is a religious one, and a lot of the traditions from the holiday are based in Zoroastrianism, which is a very, very old, very ancient holiday, pre-Islamic. It dates before Islam. So while I was there were a lot of kids, and lots of these kids were also jumping over the fire. There was a 6-year-old that I met named Nero. She was dressed in this cool teal jumpsuit, snowsuit, and she was all bundled up and ready for battle. And she kept on, every time she jumped over the fire, she would rejoin the line and do it again, rejoin the line and do it again. So I spoke to her dad, and then I interviewed Nero very professionally.
So tell me what you just did over there.
I jumped over 3 batches of fire.
3 batches of fire? Why did you do that?
It's just a tradition that I do.
What were you feeling when you were jumping over the fire?
I felt brave.
Nero was one of many brave kids out that night. Her family told me that they're from Afghanistan, which is they also celebrate Nowruz there. And there's a phrase actually that you're supposed to say as you're jumping over the fire. It goes, "Sorkhie to az man, zardi man az to." And it's really an exchange that you're doing with the fire. You're saying all of your health and wealth to me, and all of my pain and badness to you. So it's a bad deal for the fire, but it's a good deal for you.
And isn't it interesting, Shamita, that in ancient times, in so many different cultures, long before anything we would think of as modern astronomy or other kinds of science, the new year in various traditions wound up either at the solstice or the equinox.
Sure, that's
so
right.
Like this is for the spring equinox. The Jewish New Year starts at the autumn equinox. Our New Year starts, at the winter solstice. Somehow it's to mark the change of the seasons, these very 4 defining points of the year, all stemming from ancient times.
Yes, and I happen to think that spring is a perfectly apt time to celebrate the coming of the new year, though it's very unspring-like today and for the next few days. 32 degrees right now in New York, and that's the latest from the WNYC newsroom and from the Greene Space. I'm Shamita Basu.
On the next Fresh Air, how early Christianity expanded from a small group
to the religion of the Roman Empire. We talk with religion scholar Bart Ehrman, who's written a new book on the subject. We'll also talk about his own conversion from born-again Christian to being a self-described Christian agnostic. Join us. Today at 2 on 93.9 FM WNYC.
WNYC is supported by The Band's Visit, a new Broadway musical. A mix-up sends a group of Egyptian musicians to a remote Israeli town. When the locals take them in for the night, their lives intertwine. Ticket information at thebandsvisitmusical.com. Riverside Memorial Chapel, for generations a symbol of Jewish tradition. More info about arranging or pre-arranging funeral services available at 212-362-6600 or riversidememorialchapel.com. City National Bank, working to help businesses, entrepreneurs, and their families for over 60 years. City National Bank, the way up. Learn more at cnb.com. WNYC is a media partner of Strand Bookstore, presenting Pen Out Loud, Reimagining A Wrinkle in Time, celebrating unconventional literary heroes with readings from A Wrinkle in Time and related texts. March 26th at 7 p.m., strandbooks.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone, as we are live in the Greene Space today. More than 100 people came to watch a radio show. Is that crazy or what? But you are those people, so thank you for coming. Give yourselves a round of applause. And as always, when we're in the Greene Space, you can watch the Brian Lehrer Show as well as listen to it, because we have the capacity to stream live video from the Greene Space stage, so you can just go to wnyc.org and watch us do the show. Also at thegreenspace.org, if that website is easier for you to get to. Joining me now is Ayman Ismail. He is a Slate video producer and host of Who's Afraid of Ayman Ismail, and he's been looking at the role of Muslim men in the emerging Mosque Me Too movement. For example, Muslims around the world, of course, celebrate Hajj, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's the requirement of Muslims who are healthy and can afford to do so to travel to Mecca at least once in their lifetime. Well, once they arrive, both men and women perform a ritual of praying while making 7 circles around the Kaaba. That's a black cubic structure in the middle of the Great Mosque. But that's where the similarities end. What's supposed to be an egalitarian ritual sometimes turns into instances in which women are sexually assaulted. We've covered the Me Too movement, obviously, by looking at sexual abuse in many walks of life, in the Olympics, at the Ford factory in Chicago, with low-paid workers, restaurant workers, on the show the other day, campus sexual assault. But what about religion? What role can the Me Too movement play in religions, and how can both genders work to facilitate that conversation? Welcome back to WNYC. I'm Ismail.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody here. This is kind of amazing.
And just so people get a little context on you, the series that you're doing on an ongoing basis on Slate is Who's Afraid of Ayman Ismail. And this started when you went to cover the Republican convention in Cleveland in 2016?
I love telling this story. It's so funny. We were trying to get our credentials. At this point, I was just a photographer. I was going to provide backup for the other reporters there to report on the RNC. And this person in this full-fledged Thomas Jefferson costume with the hat and everything approached me from behind and asked, "Are you a Muslim?" And in my mind, I was thinking, yes, finally, like this is really what I came for. I want to be everybody's one Muslim friend. So we started talking about his assumptions of what I believed, and I was helping walk him through what I actually do believe. And in the end, the conversation sort of abruptly ended when he refused to recognize that Thomas Jefferson was himself guilty of sex crimes.
And some of the videos that you have on this site, because this is mostly a video project, for example, Season 1, Episode 8. Everyone thinks Muslims shouldn't celebrate Christmas. I'm doing it anyway.
Right. That was to sort of explore something that I didn't really necessarily have the answers to. This comes up every year. I sort of debate with my other Muslim friends whether or not we're allowed to. Our parents sometimes believe that this is a religious holiday, so we shouldn't be celebrating the birth of Christ. But since, at this point, it sort of turned into just a festival of love and celebrating and family and eating. And those are all things that Muslims love to do, so why not?
It's an American holiday of shopping.
Yeah.
And another one, season 1, episode 6, Fox News claimed a Sharia court is enforcing Islamic law in Texas. So I went to see it. What did you see?
That guy was really funny. He would throw his hands up and be like, I don't know what all this attention is for. You know, all the religions have some sort of mediation center where people can elect to get advice from a spiritual counselor. And he is facing legal battle. So people are trying to shut him down because they're afraid of the word Sharia itself. And then they start projecting things like female genital mutilation or unequal treatment of women, things that he was happy to condemn on camera, but that didn't stop the lawsuit.
So those are some of the things that you do on a more lighthearted basis in your series. On a very serious note, in response to the Me Too movement, as you know, many Muslim women began sharing their experiences of sexual assault within their communities online, just like other women. But many Muslims, both men and women, are worried that speaking out about sexual assault and harassment will further promote anti-Islamic sentiment in America. Can you explain the tension there?
Yeah, I can't speak to the experience. I'm not a Muslim woman who experienced sexual harassment. But I could speak to how their stories are hijacked by people on the right and elsewhere who want to justify their bigotries. So, for example, when Muna Eltahawy, the subject of the video, came out and was sharing her story, there were many people who were happy to use her story as evidence of the stereotype of Muslim men being barbarians who can't control their sexual desires. And it was also used as evidence of how an Islamic invasion of the West could be the end for women in the West, you know? So I think that's something that she had to consider before coming out and sharing her story, knowing that some people are ready to use that story to, assault the reputations of Muslim men.
As if there weren't enough barriers already to coming out with people's Me Too stories. So here's a clip of Mona Eltahawy, the Egyptian-American activist and journalist, from your Who's Afraid of Ayman Ismail Slate interview. This is 35 seconds of her story of sexual assault during Hajj.
We moved to Saudi Arabia when I was 15. And 3 weeks after my family moved to Saudi Arabia, we went on Hajj. And you enter the Grand Mosque of Mecca and it's this wonderful feeling of reverence. It's incredible. And then I feel a hand on my ass. I'm like, are you kidding me? I must be imagining this. This cannot be happening.
Oh my God.
So I tried to scrum free, but this man is determined. He is on a mission and it is not pilgrimage.
Seriously?
He just kept his hand on my ass. He was determined. So I just burst into tears. How can I tell my parents when the Kaaba's right there that this bastard behind me is sexually assaulting me?
Whoa.
Yeah.
So how'd you come upon that story, and why did you feel that you should amplify it in your video series?
So the story itself came about when I came upon the hashtag MosqueMeToo, and that was all the work of Mona Eltahawy. Her life's work has been to to elevate Muslim women's voices, and she did an excellent job in sharing that hashtag, and it was used several hundred times. People were coming out from all over the world sharing their stories of sexual harassment. And these were all stories that they kept to themselves for so long. She herself kept that story to herself for years before having the courage to share it openly. And when she did, it became this phenomena of people on both the right and the left, and the Muslim men and not Muslim men, coming in and trying to discredit her. It was vicious, the attention that she got, the attacks on her character and the attacks on her credibility, just to... I think it's a misguided effort to protect the reputation of Islam, or in the case of the right, it's a misguided effort to assault Islam in the West in general. So I think that really galvanized me in wanting to approach the story with a more nuanced lens and try to understand what makes it so hard for women who are Muslim to join the Me Too movement.
And the incident that Mona was describing there actually took place way back in 1982.
Right.
But it was this year when she shared her story on Twitter with that hashtag that you mentioned, Mosque Me Too, and that hashtag has inspired an outpouring of similar stories from other women. And what Mona told you essentially was, who would believe that something so terrible had happened in such a sacred place?
Yeah.
So is the issue here victim shaming, or is sexuality seen as too taboo to talk about, even in cases of assault, and that's the hurdle to get over?
I think it's a combination of both those things. But really, I think the root of the problem is that men in general are not properly educated on how to talk about things like sexual assault. I think, at least when I try to talk about it with Muslim men, their first initial reaction is to say, well, no, not all Muslim men are like this. You know, this probably doesn't happen as often as we're suggesting that it might. But I believe that one is too many, you know. These aren't people that are, far and few between. These are people within our own communities. And I learned it from myself. I made it my mission to try to talk to as many Muslim men as possible, and just as many men as possible about this crime happening amongst us. So I think one of the reasons why it's so important for us men to talk about this issue is because ultimately it is a men's issue. This is something that's happening to women. It's not a women's issue in the sense that they have the power to control it or to end it. It's really up to us men to make sure that we create a safe environment where they don't have to worry about their safety.
So that's so true, that this can't just be women speaking about things related to Me Too and other things having to do with gender equality that aren't even sexual harassment or assault. If men don't also step up and say these words and then actually help to police equality in their workplaces and things like that, it's just going to be so much harder to bring the change that, even if we say we want to see it and then don't do anything, it's not going to happen. Also joining us briefly now on the phone is Salma El-Kadi Ajubader, a licensed professional counselor in private practice, founding board member of a group called Peaceful Families Project, which is a national nonprofit focused on ending domestic violence in Muslim communities. Welcome to WNYC, Salma.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you having me on the show today.
So, with respect to the Peaceful Families Project, what has the Mosque Me Too hashtag or movement meant for your community and your practice?
I think that it's a really welcome opportunity for us to take what I've heard, in private conversation in my therapy office for more than 25 years, to take that into the public space. And it gives us a real opportunity to amplify the voices of survivors, and also to use this movement as a catalyst for change among the community leaders. And as Ayman is saying, and I appreciate your work, Ayman, for individuals also to become involved in ending sexual assault and all forms of gender-based violence.
Is your work, being in the Muslim community in general, dependent on being culturally aware and culturally sensitive? I mean, to some degree, like so many issues we talk about, the issues are universal, but the applications sometimes are more effective if we know, particular cultural practices or ways of communicating in whatever culture.
Absolutely. So the work that we do with Peaceful Families Project is all from within the Islamic paradigm. So we use Quranic teachings and the model of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, to really speak to people using the values that they already believe in, using verses that they're already familiar with, and just amplifying the mandate that we have as Muslims to stand for justice, to fight all forms of oppression, so that includes sexual assault, and to work together as believing men and women to enjoin what is right and forbid what is wrong. And obviously, any kind of sexual assault, especially in a religious space, is wrong and oppressive.
What's your understanding as a practitioner in this field of how religion, assuming that what you just said is true, gets misinterpreted to result in so many people feeling like the patriarchy is exactly what the religion enables?
I mean, I think this is common across faith traditions that patriarchal values and misogyny can often, people can take teachings and misuse them, actually abuse them to further their purposes. We see that in many things in which, religion is hijacked to promote, people's objectives. But if people go back to their faith teachings, the values of, justice and mercy and, proper treatment for men and women, these are the values that we all know are true. But there will always be people who will take things out of context to further their own agenda or to justify their misbehavior.
Eamon, you want to get in on this with Salma? What are you thinking, or do you want to ask her anything?
I do want to ask whether or not the mass of women coming out and finally having a place to share this specific story, whether or not that we will see effect change, or what will it actually take to see the change that we all want to see?
I mean, I think that these conversations have to continue, and people have to keep talking because, breaking the silence really is the first step. And when enough people come forward and when the conversation is sustained, then leadership will be forced, to confront this issue and to make changes. So I think that, change is a process. It can take a lot of time, but we've already seen changes happening in the, general public and, with the Harvey Weinstein case. I mean, a lot of change is happening, and so we just have to be persistent in speaking about these issues, getting more people on board, getting individuals to see their role, rather than being passive bystanders, to actually jump in the conversation, to say, hey, that's not right. If they see something happening in front of them, to believe women when women come forward, rather than to, first ask, well, what were you doing there, or how did you contribute to this? The victim blaming and victim shaming is what's kept people from coming forward. So the more people that, are willing to have this conversation, I think the more that it can be a real catalyst for change.
Let me ask you both, with respect to Hajj in particular, since that was sort of, the origin of the Mosque Me Too hashtag was Mona Eltahawy telling her story of being sexually assaulted at Hajj, and then the larger thought that it's sadly common. One of the fears associated with the movement is that Muslim religious officials, who are predominantly men, might use it to segregate women from men during Hajj, which women are afraid might mean restricting women's access to the holiest part of the Great Mosque. I'm just curious if that idea has been floated, if either of you are aware, and what that might look like. Eamon?
Yeah, I think we've seen that same rationale used over and over again. It's the same logic that was used when advocating for women to be segregated at all. It's to save them from Muslim men in mixed spaces, and it's also the same logic that was used to restrict their ability to drive. So they wouldn't be caught alone and abused that way. But I think in both of those cases, it's never solved the issue at hand. Women still, as evidenced by the Mosque Me Too hashtag, still don't have a safe space. So I don't think that by further segregating the genders that we will be creating a safe space for them. I still think that it really comes down to policing the space better and making sure that there is no room for that kind of crime to take place.
So often separate is unequal, no matter what, in theory, people claim the intention is. Salma, any thought about that?
Sure. I mean, I agree with everything that Eamon said, and as a Muslim woman who's been both to Hajj and to Umrah, there are parts of, there are some of the rituals that are separated, like when we visit the Prophet's tomb. And I can say that as it is, women have less times when they have that opportunity to participate in the ritual. We already do have less access, and I think that it's really important, rather than women to, again, bear the brunt. So women have been victimized, and now they'll be having more, restricted access. That the focus has to shift where it belongs, which is on the perpetrators, and also on the broader society and leadership to educate people and to change people's attitudes so that there's a respect, and so that men who are performing Hajj are looking out for their fellow sisters in Islam who are also trying to perform this very important ritual, that we should be working together to create this climate of safety. And the leadership has to also take a strong stand and have punishments for those people who are offending.
One more clip from Mona Eltahawy from your video with her, Ayman, in which she weighs in on what she wants to happen next.
I insist, I demand that the Imam of the Grand Mosque talk about this. Get on the pulpit and say, you must respect sisters everywhere, especially here during Hajj. This has to be said out loud. And I don't want him to say, we're going to protect you. I don't want him to say, we're going to segregate you. I want none of those things. I want him to put this front and center and talk about this, because all these men who are writing to me saying you're lying, you're making us look bad, who paid you, it's a Zionist, it's the I don't know what. No, once he says it, a whole bunch of men who don't want to believe us will hear it.
So to finish up, Ayman, as a Muslim man and a journalist, how do you see your role in this?
Specifically as a Muslim man and a journalist, I think it's up to people like me, and it's also up to people like you to make sure that men everywhere are held accountable. I agree that everything really does come down to accountability, and it's not a unique issue for the Muslim world. It's sort of a universal issue. And I really do in my heart believe that if we make sure that the criminals who are committing these crimes are held accountable for their actions, and the people who are supposed to create this safe space are also held accountable, that will be a much more effective means of destroying sexual harassment in a place like Hajj than merely segregating the genders.
Ayman Ismail is host of Slate's video series, Who's Afraid of Ayman Ismail? Salma El-Qadi Abu Jader is a counselor in private practice and a founding board member of the Peaceful Families Project. Thank you so much both for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC will continue live in the Greene Space, and we're expecting an update on the announcement moments ago by Cynthia Nixon that she's running for governor of New York. Stay with us.
I'm Nancy Dwyer Chapman, and I'm a proud member of the Listeners Legacy Circle. I really think it's important to show your appreciation through support, and that can be by what I've done, which is to put WNYC in my will.
Include WNYC in your estate plan. Call 646-829-4587 or email legacygiving@wnyc.org.
WNYC supporters include Cardozo School of Law in Greenwich Village, offering law students classes in fashion, arts, media, and entertainment law, as well as digital privacy and blockchain. Cardozo Law School, bringing law to life.
The Met, now on view, Thomas Cole's Journey Atlantic Crossings, featuring Cole's 19th century American landscapes alongside European paintings that inspired the artist on his travels. More at metmuseum.org.
There's plenty to like about tweets and posts, but they don't convey the depth of a story.
It's about these kids. Now, are you sending your children to school this morning knowing that they're going to be safe? Are you sending them to school just hoping that they're going to be safe? I mean, that's the kind of country we live in.
Get to the heart of the news. Listen to Morning Edition every day on WNYC.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live from the Greene Space. And when we're doing the show in the Greene Space, you can watch the show as well as listen. You can see live streaming video at WNYC.org. You might say empathy is the current it word. Every generation or time has one, right? According to my next guest, like self-esteem in the 1980s. Empathy is now taught in workshops across the country and in preschools and even business schools. But it's also a word that has many different definitions and applications, and let's not dismiss something this profound as a trend, right? The word really shouldn't be used lightly. My next guest wanted to understand, as she puts it, empathy's purpose and its practice. So she embarked on a journey of research and practice where she attended all sorts of classes intending to teach different kinds of empathy. She learned about large-scale empathy undertaken by courtrooms and truth and reconciliation commissions, and perhaps the most difficult of all, turned inward to practice self-empathy. Chris Beam is an assistant professor at William Patterson University in New Jersey, is the author of several books, and her new one is called I Feel You, The Surprising Power of Extreme Empathy. Hi, Professor Beam. Welcome back to WNYC.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Do we need to define empathy first? Do people define it in different ways?
People define it in so many different ways. I think pre-theory, we think of it as standing in another person's shoes, but I found that there were many, many definitions. One of the ones that I liked most of all was one that I found in South Africa, which was empathy as an interruption of power, which is one that I think we don't think about very often. So that's another definition. Another one is just a way of sort of imaginatively stepping into another person's experience, which if you take that apart a little bit, it's imagining how I might experience you experiencing something or how I might experience me experiencing something. So you have to break that one down a little bit. Another one is to think about empathy as receptivity, which is I have to receive what you are experiencing rather than just imagining or putting myself in your shoes. So there's a lot of different ways we think about empathy.
I noticed on that first one you brought up, Interrupting Power, that's one of the chapters in your book. Can you talk about that a little more?
Yeah, it was interesting. I went to South Africa because at the time there was the head of Vlakplaas, which was the top prison, the top apartheid prison. The head of Vlakplaas, Eugene de Kock, was being released on parole. And I couldn't imagine how somebody like that could be released. He had originally been sentenced to 2 life terms and 212 years for crimes against humanity. So he wasn't originally part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because his crimes were so gross. And they released him because he had basically gone to his victims and told them that he was sorry. And his victims had said, we need to let him go. And the Minister of Justice said he has expressed enough remorse. And I couldn't understand, because we would never do that in this country. We would never, ever, ever take someone who had committed such gross crimes and said, well, this guy's done enough. Let's let him out. And one of the reasons that they thought that he should come out is because of this idea of interrupting power. They thought, if we keep him in there, he's essentially standing in as the one bad apple, and we're not taking responsibility for the way that we're complicit in South Africa's crimes.
And you tell a story of yourself. We're making a leap here, but
Sure.
There's a thread that runs even between that story and your own story of what happened to you on Halloween a few years ago.
Oh, that was interesting. So I was here in New York. I live in New York. And about 8 years ago, I was coming home from teaching. I was teaching a class, and I was on the subway platform, and a bunch of kids jumped me. And they attacked me, and they were calling me names, and they were calling me dyke. And I thought, and they beat me up. And I was totally dehumanized at that moment. And actually, as they left, they said, it's really bleeding. It's really bleeding. We better run. And I thought at the time, I used an expletive. You could have been my students, and what I wanted to do at that moment was the police afterwards wanted to find the kids and get them, and we never did because they were in costumes. But what I really wanted to do was sit them down and talk to them. I kind of wanted to talk to them in a bad way. I wanted to to yell at them. I didn't really want to talk to them nicely, but I wanted to make them see the humanity of me. I wanted to ask them, had they ever been dehumanized? And then I wanted to find out, could they see me as a human being and see what that "it" statement had really done? And so it made me really look into victim offender mediation programs, because I think that there are a lot of us that when we have crimes committed against us, we don't just want to see someone punished and put into a cage. We want to actually see that kind of mediation happen.
Restorative justice.
Restorative
it's
justice.
sometimes called, right?
Right.
And in fact, there's a restorative justice court, the Red Hook Community Justice Center in Brooklyn, that you're familiar with.
Yeah, there's a court here that's really interesting, where the Judge Calabrese, is a really interesting person, because he's a judge for where he serves as a judge for the housing court, for criminal court, and for family court all at once. So he can handle multiple court cases together. So if somebody comes in for example, for stealing something, he can find out if they're stealing because they are having trouble at home, and are also, maybe their kids are missing school because the family is having trouble, and he can sort of handle multiple situations at once instead of the family then having to enter all these different court systems. And he can handle things much more empathically by seeing a whole picture, which many court systems aren't able to do.
Now, listeners, if you have a question for Chris Beam about empathy, give us a call, 212-433-WNYC. Same thing here in the Greene Space. Raise your hand if you want to say something or ask something. Chris Beam from William Patterson University is the author now of I Feel You, The Surprising Power of Extreme Empathy. Why the word extreme?
I think because we love the word extreme. I wasn't in charge of the subtitle. I think it's extreme sports drinks, extreme everything. No, I mean, in all seriousness, I think...
empathy meets marketing.
Yeah, exactly. I think we want to see how far empathy can go. And that was one of the things that I was curious about, was to see, for example, in the South Africa section, I really was curious about, like, what does it mean to have empathy for the enemy? And how is there, I look to a lot of Holocaust literature, for example, to say, like, is it a perversion to even imagine having empathy for the enemy? And is it a useful project to even do that? And so that was what I was exploring.
And I see you're worried that empathy is now being, quote, positioned as a skill, something to be coveted and calculated rather than a more ineffable ethic or a value practiced out of instinct or for some intrinsic moral good, unquote, from your book. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that, positioned as a skill?
Well, we're seeing that in a lot of the schools, for example, and I think that that's being pushed by some of the corporations. We see there's a real corporate desire for empathy, and by that I mean when the corporations have things called like empathic branding or empathic marketing. By that I mean when you go online to shop for dog food and there's a news story about a dog in the next moment in your news feed, they're calling that empathy. They're calling that empathic marketing. And they're then looking to, and I don't just think of that as a bastardization of a term. I think of that as something a little bit more serious is afoot here. I think that we start to feel empathized with. We start to feel that our world is being curated toward us and we're being felt for. And marketers and business people are feeling like the children of tomorrow need to develop this skill as empathizers. And so they're pushing this skill set in the schools, and they're talking about empathy being taught as a skill rather than as a moral stance, as you mentioned. And so they want it to be something that's numeratizable, something that's gradable, something that you can sort of check off rather than something that's modeled.
I'm trying to figure out how I feel about that. Like,
yeah.
If we're...
I don't feel great about it.
Right. No, I can tell. But I'm thinking even if it's communicated in a commercial sense, even if it's communicated as a skill to be learned for your own purposes, which is sort of the opposite of empathy, where you're supposed to be identifying outwardly.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it trained your empathy muscle, and then you start to think in those terms more than if this hadn't come up?
Maybe, but I think that if we are always, I think that we live in an acquisitional culture so much that if we're always looking to acquire something, like we get good grades because we did it, rather than we're doing it just for the good of itself, then we're missing the whole point, the essential nature of it.
And some of what you write write in the book tells us about how sort of intrinsic to conscious beings empathy is. You tell us about the researcher who found, through studying macaque monkeys, that empathy is a neurological fact. And there are researchers who found empathy in babies before they could be socialized, correct?
Right. So there's, a part of the reason that we've had such a surge in all things empathy is the researcher Rizzolatti in the early 90s was discovering mirror neurons. And what they found was that these neurons would fire in macaques when they would put in little tiny fibers into the brain, and they would, which we haven't been able to replicate in humans. So we haven't seen this in humans because we can't stick these little fibrous probes into humans yet, because it's sort of ethically challenging. So it's not so empathic toward the monkeys.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, exactly. But what happens is when the monkey, in the action area of the brain, what used to fire when the monkey would move, say, to pick up an apple, the monkey's neurons, those action neurons would fire when the monkey watched someone else pick up an apple. So suddenly they said, wow, this is empathy. The monkey is actually imagining the action of another person or another being pick up an apple. Well, what they've since said is that may not be empathy. All we know is that these action neurons are firing. We don't actually know what the intent or the meaning behind it is. All we know is that they're firing. But what it did was it caused a whole lot of spillage. A lot of response happened, and a lot of people said, wow, we have this interest in empathy. Let's now study empathy. And empathy was suddenly everywhere. And it caused, like you said, a lot of studies to happen. People then started studying babies. What we know in babies is what we call empathy is babies imitate one another. This is pretty low-level stuff. This is like babies yawning when babies yawn, babies cry when babies cry. This is mirroring more than it is empathy at a deeper level.
Let's take a phone call. Here is Jean in Brooklyn. Jean, you're on WNYC with Chris Beam. Hi.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I recall reading an article a couple of months ago in the science section of the New York Times, which spoke to me because I feel sometimes that I'm too empathetic in that I get extremely upset when I read terrible things happening to children, to other people, parents, Syria, whatever. And this article said that there was a study that showed that people who are overly empathetic are less able to address problems because they feel overwhelmed by the problems than people who are highly sympathetic. And I really thought that was a very interesting point, and I wonder if you are aware of that and what you think about that. Because sometimes I do feel like almost paralyzed by being so upset about things.
That's interesting. I don't know that particular study, but I do think it's interesting to think about the difference between empathy and sympathy. Empathy, the idea being that you simply feel the other person's feelings or feel the other person's experience, and you can step right into it. Sympathy being that you feel for them, and there's an element of action to it where you want to take some kind of action. So maybe if you have sympathy, you take it a step further. I mean, empathy we tend to think of as a precursor to justice or to good citizenship. It's sort of what we need to have as a building block. But maybe you are getting overwhelmed by empathy because there's no action in it. It's just feeling all the feelings and not having anywhere to go.
Right. And that I do feel that myself sometimes.
Yeah, no, I understand. I feel you.
Jean, thank you very much. Yeah, I know other people like that too. Jean, you're not alone if it helps. That there are some people who really can't watch the news, for example.
Right.
Not to mention deal with things in their personal lives like off the screen or off the page because they just feel it so intensely. It's like, I just can't deal with this.
Right.
You know, and I've had one friend ask me, how can you even work in this business where you have to deal with like the worst things in the world on a day-by-day basis?
And how do you?
How do I? Well, I think that journalists, I think you can't be a person like Jean and go into this field, for one thing. And you develop a thick skin. And to me, it's like two separate parts of my brain or my emotional self, where at the one hand, I'm motivated to do this kind of work, as I think so many journalists are, because I really care about what goes on in the world and care about truth and care about justice and things like that. And at the same time, become a little bit almost like trained, desensitized.
Right.
In a way that you have to manage. You have to manage both.
Right. I think that's really smart. So you empathize to a point, and then you're able to intellectualize. So you sort of do this dance.
Yeah, and you have to not fall off either side. That's part of the dance, right? So you don't become too detached and think of it like a show, for example, just a show. And, oh, this is going to be so interesting. We'll talk about this.
Right.
This horrible massacre of 25 people, you know.
Right.
And on the other hand, just make sure you've got your tentacles up, like with what you were talking about, even like what Eamon was talking about in the last segment, for people really unlike you.
Right.
Who are going through things, so that your definition of us expands. Your definition of we expands to the maximum possible amount, so that you're really dealing with the things that matter the most in the world, not just the things that matter most that are the closest to you.
Exactly.
So anyway, that's who's... Wait a minute. I'm supposed to be asking the questions here. And we will continue in a minute.
I know, but I'm a journalist, so it flips.
Journalist and William Patterson University Professor Chris Beam, author of the book, I Feel You, The Surprising Power of Extreme Empathy. Stay with us.
Charlie Wing knew something was up with his son, Chaz.
I just couldn't quite I didn't understand the depth of what had been happening to him.
He says what started as bullying turned into something even worse.
At the time, I just didn't know there had been a sexual assault.
On the next Reveal. Tonight at 8 on 93.9 FM, WNYC.
Support for WNYC comes from the John Theurer Cancer Center at Hackensack University Medical Center, part of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Hackensack Meridian Health Partnership. More at jtcancercenter.org. Rallo Rugs, located at 50 Orchard Street. For over 30 years, Rallo has been offering authentic, handcrafted, modern, and traditionally designed rugs. Closing spring 2018. More at RalloTibetanRugs.com. WNYC local public affairs reporting is supported in part by the New York Community Trust, helping charitable New York make a lasting difference.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC, live in the Greene Space today with our guest Chris Beam, author of I Feel You, The Surprising Power of Extreme Empathy. We're going to take a question from here in the Greene Space audience, and then we're going to wrap it up because we're going to go to our Bridget Bergen in a couple of minutes, who's got some breaking news on somebody moving from the theatrical world to the world of running against Andrew Cuomo for the Democratic nomination for governor, to be very specific. Where's that question here? Hi.
Hi, I'm Dan from Westchester. So your examples, the political examples, were kind of retrospective, such as truth commissions or forgiving Nazis. I'm wondering if it can be prospective. Could it help prospectively? And I was thinking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that has gone on for, you could say 70, you could say 150 years, and they've made no progress. Can you counsel Palestinians being empathetic towards Israeli soldiers or settlers? Can you counsel Israelis being empathetic towards terrorists? Would that help?
I don't know that I would frame it exactly in that way for empathy to really foster in that region. I think that, if empathy is an exercise in understanding, I think that one has to first really imagine the other person's experience and really be able to listen to the other person's experience. And that is so hard when you have a history of brutality like we have in Israel and Palestine. And I am nobody to be able to answer that kind of complicated history and trauma of that region.
And we're going to run out of time, but I heard somebody say something once about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that could apply to any deep-seated conflict in the world, and it was kind of like we have to never forget whatever atrocities have been committed, but we also, in a certain way, have to have the courage to forgive.
Right.
And so forgive and forget don't always have to be matched. You can do one and do the other and find a way to go on, whereas otherwise you might not be able to go on.
Yeah, I think that's really wise.
So we're going to leave it there with Chris Beam, assistant professor at William Patterson University in New Jersey and author of books, including her new one, which is called I Feel You, The Surprising Power of Extreme Empathy. Thank you so much
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Brian Lehrer on WNYC. We've just got a few minutes left in the show, but our Bridget Bergen has been covering the official announcement, which has been taking place this hour, that Cynthia Nixon will run against Andrew Cuomo for the Democratic nomination for governor of New York. Hi, Bridget.
Hey, Brian.
So we've got about 2.5 minutes. Set the scene for us.
Well, I'm at the Bethesda Healing Center. It's a Pentecostal church in Brownsville, Brooklyn. And just a few moments ago, Cynthia Nixon wrapped up giving her first speech to a live audience of supporters who are supporting her run for governor. She talked a lot about inequality. That was really the theme of the speech. And she hit hard against Andrew Cuomo on the issue of corruption. She said if Washington is a swamp, Albany is a cesspool. So we'll expect to hear a lot more of that. Somewhat ironically, the event started late because Cynthia Nixon and her team had subway delays. She had to get off a 3 train because there were some issues with it on her way here. And so, again, another issue that we will expect to hear a lot of between now and September, problems with the subway system.
Well, I think we have that clip of her starting. Let's see if we have that.
Thank you all for coming. I got here just in the nick of time. I allowed an hour and a half for what should have been a 30-minute ride. Cuomo's MTA. 3 trains pulled out of service. We had to get off 3 trains. All right.
So, Bridget, did she take questions from reporters? And if so, did anybody ask her whether this is a serious run to be elected governor of New York, or if she's running a protest candidacy to draw attention to some issues? Because obviously, if she's really hoping to unseat Andrew Cuomo, then they've got to ask her about not having any managerial experience and trying to go right from the kind of, and she's done activism in addition to showbiz, but going right from that to governor of New York and running this whole big state. Did that come up?
So there was a very small scrum with reporters. I was fortunate enough to be right in the center of it. But the topic in that was a lot more of the politics surrounding her campaign, some criticism she's already received from Christine Quinn, another elected official, as someone who is not qualified. She essentially said, she's doing this because she cares about New York. And during her speech, she made the point that this year is a year when hundreds and, in some cases, thousands of women are running for office for the first time, and she feels honored to join them. And so she is pleased to throw her hat in the ring.
Off she goes. And off goes Bridget Bergen, WNYC City Hall reporter. Thanks for that update. And thanks to all of you for coming to the Greene Space today. Thank you very much for being here, and thanks to everybody for listening, as always.
WNYC is supported by BAM, presenting King Lear, a new production from the Royal Shakespeare Company, directed by Gregory Doran and starring Sir Anthony Sher, April 7th to 29th. Tickets at BAM.org. Plaza Jewish Community Chapel, owned